I'm delighted to be joined now by Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary from 1995 to 1997, but an MP for a lot longer than that. Sir Malcolm, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
2 years on from the Ukraine invasion, hard to believe actually, 2 years on. What do you think is the prospect of peace there?
Well, I think you have to start by saying, what does Putin privately think?
Yeah.
What did he intend when he started this ghastly war 2 years ago? He thought it would be all over within a week and a half.
Yes.
Not even a war, a special military operation was the phrase used. It's been a total disaster for the Ukrainians, but it's been an even greater disaster for Putin, because he ends up, having been humiliated by a weaker country,
yes,
being able to actually stop the Russians and indeed reverse some of their gains. But also, this was all about NATO and question of NATO membership. What happens? Sweden and Finland,
yes,
who've been neutral for 150 years, are now members of NATO.
Yeah, NATO now strengthened.
Well, the Baltic Sea is now a NATO sea, yes, with only a very small Russian coast. Think of the gas industry, one of the most important industries for the country. Gazprom, one of the biggest companies in the world, is approaching bankruptcy. 80% of its revenue has been lost.
Agree with you, although the Russian economy is booming.
Only because of military expansion. That doesn't help ordinary Russians.
I mean, I read today 7.5% of GDP being spent on defences in Russia, which is an extraordinary
They've virtually doubled their defence expenditure, which shows how successful the Ukrainians have been.
OK, so we congratulate the Ukrainians for being successful. Having said that, we've seen Putin basically laugh in the face of the Western world with the, I think, state-sponsored assassination of Alexei Navalny. How does that change the picture?
Well, the question of the assassination of Navalny is not spitting in the face of the world. It's spitting in the face of the Russian people.
Yeah.
Because he did that because he was frightened of Navalny. When Navalny was free to operate in a normal political way, huge numbers of people were supporting him. And Putin began to panic. And this is a sign, yet all these things that Putin does, ultimately they're a sign of his weakness.
Yes.
Like having to have what is in fact a phony election. Why does he have to go through this farce of an election when everybody knows nobody else is able to stand against him? Why? Because he likes to pretend that he is a democratic leader that has legitimacy. And the Russian public aren't stupid. They know perfectly well he hasn't. Although
we haven't had an uprising in response to Navalny, because we can't have an uprising because obviously 200 or 300 people were arrested in Moscow the morning after. I remember us speaking before on this show and you were talking about being quite confident that Putin would be deposed at some point. I mean, we see Putin's reign ending either with him being deposed or indeed dying in office. What do you think the prospect is now? Not least because I think since we spoke, Prigozhin's obviously been assassinated as well.
Well, all these things that happen are not signs of Putin's strength. I know they seem to be in one sense, but they're signs of weakness, that he has to behave in this way, blowing up one of his opponents in an aircraft, killing a guy who's already locked up in an Arctic prison. Now, the fact that he has to go beyond that and dispose of them by murder, that shows ultimately his weakness. Now, Putin can hang on for a while. I mean, Russia doesn't have a Politburo like it had in the Soviet days when they got rid of Khrushchev very easily. But the people around Putin know that he has not been able to deliver this easy conflict that would destroy Ukraine and restore them to being part of the Russian Federation. Now, I'm not underestimating the problem the Ukrainians have, because they are a far smaller country. Russia is a country of 130 million people. Ukraine has about 30 million. When the war began, the Ukrainian army, do you know how big it was? About 20, 30,000. It's now got over 500,000 troops.
Yes.
It's now the most powerful army in Europe.
So you seem quite confident
in terms of numbers.
President Zelensky and his troops forcing the Russians out, or do you think ultimately there'll have to be a carving up of territory?
Well, I don't know what will happen ultimately, because so many options are possible. But what is increasingly likely is that the Ukrainians, in the short term, are going to be not able to recover all the territory they lost over the last few years. And because it started with the occupation of Crimea in 2014, they don't seem to have the military strength to do that. But what we have seen over the last year is very significant for Russia as well as for Ukraine. The Ukrainians have been superb at defending their own territory. Much more difficult, and it's always known to military people, that to actually advance and occupy your enemy's territory requires far more troops, far more weapons, whereas to defend, you just simply dig in and stop. Now, that's what the Russians have been doing over the whole of the last year. It may be the Ukrainians have to do a bit of that as well.
Sure.
And then it will be clear to Putin that he has no chance of occupying any further kind of Ukrainian territory.
Let's just move to domestic matters, in a way, domestic matters influenced by foreign policy. The scenes in the Commons last week, the scenes of From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free being projected onto Big Ben. I mean, if you don't mind me saying, you're quite a prominent Jewish former politician. How did that feel, seeing that on the mother of all parliaments?
Well, my own personal view is, first of all, the police have to be allowed operational freedom. I think they made a mistake on this occasion, because not just because of the River to the Sea slogan. I think anybody attempting to put a slogan on the walls of Big Ben for political reasons, whatever the subject is, if the police have the means to stop them doing that, they should do that right away, regardless of the subject matter. That's part of the building of Parliament. It's not there to advertise political slogans, whatever the subject. On the question of the House of Commons, look, we know that if you have a free Parliament, not just in Britain, but in real democracies, Parliaments sometimes misbehave. Mistakes are made. People behave in a way that doesn't look very impressive to the general public. Remember always the alternative. The alternative is the Russian Duma, the Chinese Parliament, where you have hundreds of people. They sit there like dummies. They all vote exactly the same way, never a word of criticism, beautifully behaved. But is that exactly the kind of House of Commons we want? So, okay, accept that occasionally it's overdone. Most of the time, Parliament is there to represent not the government, but the public as a whole, and there will be deep disagreements and at times of high emotion, which this obviously is.
You lived through these times of high emotion during the 80s, under Thatcher, of course, there were deep divisions. But this threatening behaviour towards MPs, and particularly the notion of Jewish MPs feeling threatened, or at least MPs in constituencies that have a lot of Jewish voters feeling threatened, must sort of professionally worry you, but also personally worry you.
Well, of course that is hugely distasteful and hugely concerning. Remember, the increase in anti-Muslim incidents in Britain has gone up 300% over the same period of time. Not as much as anti-Semitism, but most of the anti-Semitism is actually anti the Israeli government. It is a difference of view, very deeply held, as to Israel's government and Israel's policies, and that is inevitably what causes high emotions on both sides. And what we all need to do, particularly in a country like Britain, which is famous for its tolerance. I mean, London is the most tolerant capital city in Europe and in the wider world. A lot of people will say that, including people from other countries. So that has to be maintained. And there is a risk. Not the general public. The vast majority of British people remain despising the bigots and zealots, whichever side of the argument they come from.
Is Netanyahu a problem for Israel moving forward with the question about proportionality? Should he go?
Well, that's for the Israelis, but we know now already that something like 80% of Israelis believe he should go. And I think what will happen, he will remain in power during this period of the fighting. When the fighting stops, and it will stop, whether it's days, weeks, or even a couple of months, it will stop. Then the war coalition will break up. And although he will refuse to resign, remember what happened when he tried to bring forward these judicial reforms. 500,000 Israelis, week after week, month after month, demonstrating. It'll be twice as large. And what if they're sensible, they'll be demanding, is not Netanyahu, you must go. It will be Netanyahu, there must be a general election. If you think you have the support of the Israelis, have an election and we'll all find out whether you're right or wrong. Much more difficult for him to refuse then.
Final, very, very quick question, if you could be brief as possible. So, Malcolm, talking of elections, we're looking to the US. Donald Trump has done very well in Haley's state yesterday. Joe Biden, too old to run again?
I don't believe this stuff. First of all, Henry Kissinger lived till he was 100 and his brain was 100% clear right throughout. I know Biden. I don't know him well. I met him a few years ago. Biden, I think, has been a damn good president in very difficult circumstances.
Well, even in
if the alternative is Donald Trump, there's almost any other candidate I would vote for rather than Donald Trump. And Biden comes pretty high up my list.
On that note, to Malcolm Rifkind, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Thank you.